All right, happy Monday.
Ooh, happy Monday.
Hopefully you all had a chance to get a little bit of break over break. And for those of you that didn't, sorry. I had forgotten when I set up the syllabus that we get extra special days off, like St. Benedict's Day on Wednesday. So of course, yeah, like this Wednesday. So there's no class this Wednesday. You won't find that on the syllabus because it's St. Benedict's Day. So we've got a lot to cover this week because capital budgeting, which you're going to find is very similar to everything else that we've done, which you're going to find is very similar to everything in finance, is a really critical topic. It really is starting to translate all the stuff that we've been talking about with stocks, bonds, and time value of money into operational decisions. So for those of you who aren't finance majors, but are more marketing majors, management majors, and folks who tend to think more about business operations, this is getting closer to the pin on that. So I will we'll kind of dive into this. We're going to move relatively quickly today, and then again on Friday. If we need to carry it forward to next week, we'll do so. But this is an important concept. A couple things that I want to kind of lead off with at the outset, housekeeping stuff. Recall that the midterm is due this week. I sent everybody an email today. I'm guessing you may have gotten it as well. But the system that we use to do all the quizzes and such will be down Saturday night. Now, I'm not sure how many of you spend your Saturday nights from like 9 until midnight working. Okay, Leslie. So how many of you use your Saturday nights working 9 till midnight to do finance homework? But the system is likely to be offline. So I sent that email to you so that you can plan accordingly. Second, just wanted to take a moment for those of you who were impacted. We lost one of our very, very dear members of the community this last week. Somebody who worked on one of my teams, Ken Garland. Coach Garland passed away from cancer very quickly and somewhat unexpectedly on Friday night. So if you could remember him and his family, as well as the coaches and other folks that were impacted, if you could remember them in your thoughts and prayers. And then finally, as the midterm is due at the end of the week, I wanted to let you know that your midterm grades, to the extent you haven't looked, are already up in self-serve. Now, the midterm grades were based upon the first 6 quizzes only. So I don't have any midterm grades in there from the midterm exam for those of you who have completed it. I don't have the extra credit quiz. I don't have the attendance in there because that will all be kind of wrapped into your final grade. There's a number of you who, for various reasons, have had missed quizzes. So you've gotten zeros, which to me is a missed quiz because it's really difficult when you can guess and get a 25% that you probably didn't take it at all. Those things will tend to drag your grade down when you miss something. So kind of stay on top of it, even if you just got to slam in there and get a grade in, which is not what I would recommend you do, by the way. At least get the work done. The last piece that I wanted to cover this morning from a housekeeping perspective is if you look at the calendar in the online system, out at like May 27th or so, you'll see that I loaded up a bunch of quizzes in there for chapters 1 through 15. And you can go take those to your heart's content. So what I got was a couple students that come back to me and said, look, I'd like to be able to go practice in advance of the midterm. I'd like to be able to practice some more questions from chapter 2 or chapter 3 or chapter 4. but I can't get back into the quiz, and all I can do is look at the online resources in my book. Is there any way you could set up quizzes that don't count, so I could just do some practice problems? And so I did that. So you'll see that those are all set up on the 27th, I think, of May. You can take those as many times as you want. They won't count for anything. It gives you an opportunity to do practice questions if you want, if you're into that kind of stuff. Any questions on those housekeeping announcements before I dive into capital budgeting? Okay, so capital budgeting. Capital budgeting is nothing more than taking a fixed asset or a business asset and analyzing it similar to a financial asset. We've spent most of the semester so far really looking at financial assets and how do you value a stock, or how do you value a bond or preferred stock, and how do you choose one over another, and what are the risk profiles associated with each. Capital budgeting really takes that and says, for those of us who aren't in the investment world, for those of us who are operating businesses day to day, whether that's a sandwich shop or a multinational corporation, we have limited financial resources and we have to figure out how best to utilize those resources, and we need a tool to do so. And that tool is essentially capital budgeting. When we look at capital budgeting, this says, and this is how the book defines it, it's the process of planning and evaluating expenditures on assets whose cash flows are expected to last more than a year. In reality, you can use it for any period of time. Generally, businesses look at capital budgeting and a capital budget as the purchase of fixed assets or other depreciable assets that will extend beyond a one-year point, because in accounting land, you only depreciate those things or amortize those things if they're going to spread out over multiple years, essentially multiple business periods. From a capital budgeting perspective, they use that same mentality. So if it's a capital asset, it's depreciated or amortized. Capital budgeting, we look at that asset and try and make a determination as to which to choose or if to choose. They're basically looking at large expenditures. If I'm going to spend, and I'll use St. Martin's example, $10 million to build a new science facility, which is in the works, we need to make sure that it actually has expected value to it that meets or exceeds $10 million over time. Otherwise, the university will lose money. If we're going to build another residence hall, because the existing residence halls are either full or really old, then we need to make sure that those residence halls that we build, the new residence halls, which cost about between $7 to $11 million a piece, are going to be a high enough return on investment that the university should expend money on that versus some other thing, because we have limited amounts of capital to be able to expend money on. And so capital budgeting is nothing more than analyzing those decisions and within the framework of financial analysis and going, okay, which do we choose, or what do we choose, or do we choose it at all? And so when we get into this, you're going to see if you're comfortable with valuing a stock, if you're comfortable with valuing a bond in particular, if you're comfortable with high value of money, you'll be very quickly comfortable with capital budgeting. And if you're uncomfortable with those things, this is going to also be uncomfortable, because finance is nothing more than the analysis of a series of cash flows discounted at a particular discount rate. And capital budgeting is nothing more than looking at a series of cash flows associated with a capital asset and discounting it at a discount rate that represents the risk associated with that asset or the cost of capital associated with the firm, and determining whether to make that purchase decision or not. Any questions on that definition? Because I promised you I would say that definition every class, and I'm holding to that. So where do capital budgeting ideas come from? Where do projects, and you'll hear it called project or project finance. And so where do these things come from? And how do we go about making these determinations? And again, I'll use an example that is close to home. I'll use the example of a residence hall here at St. Martin's University, because essentially when you think about St. Martin's, as a university, we have multiple business missions. Business mission number one is what you guys are all experiencing today, which is you pay tuition and receive in return an education. And there's dollars that are exchanged, and the university at least needs to break even in order to sustain itself, in order to function. So that's one business aspect. The second business aspect is St. Martin's University runs multiple apartment complexes called residence halls, 4 of them, and a cafeteria up on the hill. At each one of those, we make investment decisions. Generally, the residence halls, if you think about it, are no different for us than they would be for any apartment provider. We provide a residence director, residence assistants, janitorial service, and maintenance and support, just like you would get at any apartment. And in return, you receive housing. In order for the university to function, we need to at least get enough of a return on the provision of that housing so that we can pay the debt associated with building that building. So when we built Spangler and Parsons, we took on debt to do that. Part of the $28 million that's owed by the university, as I had mentioned a couple times, 2 of the buildings built with that debt were Spangler Hall and Parsons Hall. And so as a result, we need to make enough money on those to pay the debt. And so our decision then, if we're going to build a 5th residence hall, or in my preference, a 4th residence hall, and we tear Barron down, for those of you who live in it, you'll understand why. I lived in it for a year. Is we need to make sure that we're going to make enough money to not only cover the cost of a new residence hall, but also the opportunity costs associated with not having a 5th residence hall, essentially a 4th residence hall. So we'll talk about it in light of that. But if you think about how St. Martin's operates, if you're going to build a new building, it needs to pay for itself. And it needs to pay for the debt associated with it. And we've got to look at things like vacancy, which is going to be driven by enrollment. And we've got to be looking at things like maintenance costs and other ongoing costs of operations. So for capital budgeting projects, really what we're looking at is new products or ideas that are incremental spend to what the company is already doing. If it's a sunk cost, if it's something that's already going to be spent or you've already committed to, that's not a new capital project. If we've already committed to Sebula Hall across the quad, then the capital budgeting for that was done at the time of construction. If we're going to add something to it, we would potentially have a new capital budgeting project. For instance, the 3rd floor, completing the 3rd floor of Sebula Hall. If any of you have been up there, you'll recognize that it's just a large open space with not much in it. And for any business, whether it's a university or whether it's your own business or the one that you're going to work in, your ability to remain competitive, your ability to grow is driven by your ability to continue to innovate, to develop new products and services, to change and adapt to what your customers are looking to try and buy in the market. And so the determination as to whether to build the new drone iPod that'll fly around and play music up in the air, or whether to build a computer that's going to be able to do your finance problems for you automatically. And if you have a choice between the two, is going to be driven by market analysis and other things, and is critical to the growth of whatever business you're in. In the university's case, our decision to build a residence hall, or our decision to add the new science building, or to add a new program like higher education, student affairs, master's degree, which is coming in the fall, is driven by looking at what do we need to do to make our offerings better? What do we need to do to make our business better? What do we need to do to appeal to students to come to St. Martin's? Because higher education is a business, and we need to be able to at least break even to function. In order to break even, we need to be able to adapt to the changing market of students, parents, and employers to continue to stay relevant. And businesses have the same issues. And there's got to be a process by which those decisions are made, because everybody can come up with great ideas. I always have great ideas. I'm sure that every one of you, if I said, you know, what could St. Martin's do differently, or what new program should we offer, or should we put a new residence hall in, or should we do this or that, you could come up with great ideas. But if I go, okay, should we put a new residence hall in or a new science building? Because we have to choose one or the other. How do you make that decision? Or if I go, we're going to add a PhD in leadership studies in the business school, or we're going to add a master's degree in environmental science in College of Arts and Sciences, and we can only do one, which one do you choose? That's where capital budgeting comes in. It allows you to look at two different projects or multiple projects and determine which of the good ideas you should choose, and it provides a framework in which to make those decisions. Any questions on what capital budgeting is? Yes, sir.
Or neither at all.
Or neither at all, because you can get to the point where you go, this program's not gonna hit the hurdle rate, and you'll hear me use hurdle rate sometimes, and this project's not gonna hit the hurdle rate, so do neither, or do both if they're independent. So here's some typical projects that you deal with in the capital budgeting world. You've got replacement decisions, and we talked about that as we, in the framework of Barron Hall, right? You're going, this building was built in 1953 or 54, so it is pushing 70 years old. The plumbing in it is old and full of yummy metal taste. The showers are not what you would expect out of a modern residence hall. And in general, the building, while it's built to withstand nuclear blast, is probably not what students are looking for today. So should we keep it, knowing that it's got some maintenance issues, electric and plumbing in particular, but also there's no private restrooms, there's no good common area, the grade isn't that great. So should we replace it with a new residence hall? And what's the trade-off? If we keep it, what does the cash flow look like? If we replace it, what does the cash flow look like? And that's a replacement decision. Then you've got an expansion decision. Do we build a fifth residence hall? So we say, okay, we're going to leave Barron Hall there. We've got a bunch of new students coming in this next fall. We would probably have the largest set of on-campus students ever if the numbers hold up on deposits. So all of a sudden, we're going to have a decent-sized freshman class. We've got what will be a huge sophomore class. This year's incoming freshman class was very large. Those of you who are sophomores came in a relatively large class as well, which would make our junior class next year relatively large. So all of a sudden, the folks who tend to stay on campus, freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, we've got large classes, which means we're going to be pretty full over in the residence halls. And there's a question as we continue to go from, for those of you that were seniors, you had 200 people in your incoming freshman class. This year's freshman class was 282. As we continue to see growth in those freshman classes, we go, we can only shove so many people in the residence halls before we need to build a new residence hall. So the question is, do we purchase an additional residence hall, build an additional residence hall, or do we say we're going to let sophomores move off campus? Or do we say we're going to let juniors move off campus if they live outside of 50 miles? Or do we not let seniors live on campus so that we create space in the residence halls? And what trade-offs do you have there? So you've got this expansion decision. Do we expand or not? And if we expand, what's the trade-offs? And capital budgeting allows us to analyze those trade-offs. You have independent and mutually exclusive projects. So independent projects are projects that really don't have any impact anywhere else. So for instance, we build a new residence hall out in the meadow over here, and we're not tearing any other residence halls down, and it's going to be funded by a set of money that's assigned to residence halls. And we've got a project that is, we're going to stand up a new PhD program in leadership in the business school. And that's going to be funded potentially by donors and tuition. Those two projects are independent. They don't rely on each other directly because one's a graduate program, which tends not to cause any pressure on housing or any demand for housing. And one is a housing project that's being driven by undergraduate enrollment and is being impacted by other factors. Those two are independent decisions. They're funded separately. The demand is separate. The cash flow is separate. You can do both, or you could do neither, and they're not going to impact each other directly. So those are independent projects. If you have mutually exclusive projects, it's where choosing one project means you cannot choose another project. And the example for that may be we're going to expand the residence hall and build a 5th residence hall, or we're going to tear Barron down and build a new one. You can't necessarily do both if you use those same constraints that we need a certain number of rooms and are funded from the same source. So you go, okay, I could build a 5th residence hall, leave Barron in place, or I could tear Barron down and build and rebuild it as a 4th residence hall, 5 stories tall, with modern amenities. You can kind of tell which direction I would go, by the way. Then those become mutually exclusive. You can't do both. You can't tear Barron Hall down and replace it with a new building, as well as build a separate 5th building if your funding constraints mean you can only do one or the other. Or, as another example in programming up on the Hill, if we say you can stand up a PhD in leadership in the business school, or we could stand up a higher ed student affairs master's degree, but we only have enough marketing dollars to do one or the other, those become mutually exclusive projects. If it's one or the other, or if it's one to the exclusion of others, those are mutually exclusive. If they're independent, that means you can do both, neither, and the decision does not impact the other. Any questions on this? Because this is an important concept, one, and two, it's one where you will tend to trip up on some of the problems that are in the book. And it's one that in the real world, you'll tend to trip up because we tend to think of projects as independent. We tend to think of projects as being, well, I can do this and this and this and this. Where in reality, when you take a step back and you look at your resources, you have resource constraints, which makes projects that appear to be independent, like an environmental science degree and a leadership degree in 2 different schools, they appear to be independent. You're using different faculty, you're using different classrooms, you're using different administration. They actually become dependent when you start looking at funding and marketing resources. So all of a sudden they become mutually exclusive as opposed to independent, even though on the surface they look like they're independent. Any questions on this concept? Okay. One of the critical things that doesn't get done too often, and the reason it doesn't get done too often is because a lot of times we don't want to know, is this concept of the post-audit. Essentially, what you do in the capital budgeting process is you come up with expected future cash flows, you come up with a discount rate, and you make a decision. You go, we're going to proceed or we're not going to proceed, and then you go. Decisions made and you execute or don't. What we rarely do is go back and analyze our decision-making process and say, was this really a good idea? Did my expected future cash flows actually match what I had modeled? And how do I improve that modeling process? And so there's this concept of a post-audit, which is really looking at, here's what I thought was going to happen. So when we stood up this new, I'll use a residence hall. When we built this new residence hall, we expected it would be 70% full. It was going to cost $10 million. We were going to charge $4,500 a semester for a room, and we were going to get a certain amount of revenue from it because we had assumptions around enrollment and demand for rooms in that building. We get 3, 4, 5 years into it, and we need to look back and go, what were we thinking? What actually happened? what happened in that building? Did we see the enrollment that we expected? Did we see the uptake in demand on that building? Or did folks go, no, I'd rather live for $3,800, I'd rather live in Barron Hall rather than $4,800 live in a new building, because I don't want to spend an extra $2,000 a year for a private bathroom. What assumptions did we make and how did those hold up? And there's two primary reasons for doing this. The first one is, how do we make our estimates better the next time? Because as we noted, these capital budgeting decisions are going to be big, meaty decisions. And if we get them wrong, if we screw up a capital budgeting decision, we could end up putting the university under. You could end up putting your business under. You go, oh, I'm going to go buy a new business, or I'm going to go buy this new piece of machinery which costs $1 million because the market's going to the moon on flying iPods. If you're wrong, why were you wrong? What was the decisions or what was the data that you used that was off, so that you don't do it again? Our job is to continuously improve in the forecasting area, and the way to do that is really to self-examine what we did and why we were off, because we're hardly ever right. I mean, we're hardly ever dead on. We tend to be off one direction or the other. We optimistic, pessimistic, etc. The second is to improve operations. So you get in there and you start looking at the reality of it. You go, maintenance costs are running high. I expected them to be $150,000 a year to maintain this new res hall. They're actually running $210,000 a year. I need to dig into that number. I need to figure out whether I had a mistake in my forecast or whether the maintenance operations for that building are inefficiently run. And should I make changes to management? Should I be making changes to process? Should I be making changes to vendors in order to bring the operations costs in line with my estimate? My forecast is still good. I believe it's right, and the operations are off. So the one is to go, hey, I was wrong, and my forecast might have been off. How do I make my forecast better next time? And the other is, my forecasts were probably right, and as I'm looking into it, to try and examine where I'm off in my forecast, I'm finding that the performance of this particular segment of my forecast, maintenance in this case, it's not being managed the way I expected. So I need to tighten up the operations there. So this is an important component of capital budgeting, and it rarely gets done. It's one where we go, okay, we're done. Building's built. It's sitting over there. I'm not looking at whether we saw the growth in engineering enrollment that we expected when we built the new building. We did, by the way. So that building, Panowitz Foundry, resulted in about a 30% increase in engineering enrollment. And we're hoping for the same thing with science. But those are the kind of analysis that rarely gets done. What was the assumption? What actually happened? And is it paying for itself? Any questions on this post-audit concept before we dig into a little bit of how to do the math? As I mentioned at the top of the class, capital budgeting is going to feel very, very, very similar to bond analysis or bond finance. Now you have a series of cash flows over time. You have discount rates. You have present values. You have rates of return. And so essentially you walk through this process and it's going to feel very much like a bond. The first one is the biggest difference. The first one is you estimate the cash flows from the project. How do you estimate the cash flows for a bond?
The rate of return over its term of the rate of return over the length of the bonds.
Yeah, in a bond, you got two sets of cash flows, right? You got, here's my coupons that are going to get paid over time, and here's my maturity amount. Your cash flows are contracted, essentially, and then you've got a risk of default. For a capital budgeting problem, well, here in a schoolhouse, you're going to be given, here's the cash flows expected from X, Y, or Z. In reality, The hardest part of capital budgeting is estimating your cash flows, both your expenses and your revenue, because you're building a new project, new residence hall, or you're launching a new product, like the Mac, and you're going, okay, what's my sales going to be? How much is it going to cost for R&D? How much is it going to cost for development? How much is it going to cost for marketing? Those estimates are the hardest part of capital budgeting. The rest of it is just like a bond. So in a bond, you've got it all contracted for you. This coupon rate, this is the maturity date, this is the maturity amount, and this is how much you got to pay for the bond today, calculate the rate of return. That's easy. Capital budgeting, in the real world, you're doing all that estimating, what the cash flow is for each component of the particular project. You evaluate the riskiness of the cash flows, just like with a bond. You evaluate the riskiness of the cash flows associated with this project. What's the likelihood that the project is going to be successful? What's the likelihood of default, which is the project's not successful? What's the liquidity risk? What's the interest rate premium? What are the same components that you're going to go into pricing a bond? All those same components go into risk, which is why we studied it earlier, because it's really the same analysis. It's just a little bit different project. You compute the present value of the expected future cash flows. Estimate the asset's value to the firm. It's a finance problem. All finance problems are basically the same. What's the present value of the expected future cash flows discounted at a rate driven by the risk? Every finance problem is the same. And number 3 is essentially every finance problem. And then 4 is where you get into a little bit more of the capital budgeting piece, but we talked about it in light of stocks and bonds, which is compare the future value, or compare the present value of expected future cash flows with the present value based upon the discount rate associated with the asset. And if your present value is high enough, if your rate of return is over your required rate of return, if your net present value, which we'll talk about, is over 0 or 0 or above, you do the project. If they're mutually exclusive projects, you take the highest. It's a pretty straightforward process. It's not rocket science stuff. If you can do a bond, you can do capital budgeting from the math side. From two down, it's the same as a bond. Number 1 is the hard part. And here in class, you won't have to do a lot of build this project out and try not to make cash flows. If you're wrong, you get fired. In reality, this is the hard part. This is relatively straightforward. Any questions on this? How many of you are getting comfortable with the fact that every finance problem is almost identical to each other, just puts different words around it? Show of hands. About a third of the class. And then there's the shy ones who won't raise their hands. And then there's the sleepy ones. Net present value. Net present value is an Excel function. It's awesome. Because all you do, and those of you who have come to office hours know that I go right to net present value and internal rate of return. Those are the two. Like if you're going to use formulas, net present value is the formula to use. Net present value is awesome sauce, and it's in Excel. All you got to do is line the cash flows up, and it'll calculate for you. So net present value is essentially the sum of the expected future cash flows discounted at the discount rate. If you look at the net present value, if the net present value is greater than 0, you proceed with the project. Essentially what you have, if the net present value is greater than 0, you've got a project that is giving you additional wealth beyond your discount rate. What this will do is essentially discount it back. So if the rate of return on that project is equal to your required rate of return, the net present value equals 0. And we talked about this in light of bonds a little bit ago. If the net present value is positive, that means you're getting a higher rate of return on the project than you expected based upon the risk of the project. So you're going to build wealth. And again, from a finance perspective, building wealth or economic profit is getting a higher rate of return for your asset than the risk really dictates. And so 2 questions. If you have a project with a net present value that's greater than 0, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a good thing. Why?
You're not losing money.
You're not losing money. It's profitable. It's economically profitable. It may be accounting profitable even if the NPV is lower than 0. The NPV could be negative because this is discounted at your required rate of return, but it could show an accounting profit. And so let me give you this little piece of advice. When you go out in the real world and you're dealing with folks who haven't had this finance class, and they do their business case, and they go, we're going to make a profit, and I guarantee it. You may or may not want that investment. You may or may not want that project, even if it's showing a profit. Why?
Profit's too small.
The profit's too small. Does everybody understand the profit's too small concept?
It's not worth the hassle.
It's not worth, not just the hassle, what's
The opportunity cost could be, it's not worth the return.
it's not worth the return, and the return is driven by what?
Discount rate.
And the discount rate's driven by what? You're on roll.
We're seeing future class by risk.
Risk. So the project isn't worth it because it's too risky. Even though there's a profit associated with it, you're going, hey, the risk to get this little profit, it ain't worth it. If I said, give me $1 million, I'm going to go invest it, I'll give you $1 tomorrow. Trust me. It probably ain't worth it. You can trust me, but it probably ain't worth it. So if the net present value, you're going to have times when you're managing folks and they're going to come to you and go, I got this great idea, look, it's going to make money. It may not make enough money because you haven't factored in the risk. And what capital budgeting does is by having this discount rate built in, it factors in the risk for you and says, this is risky, this is less risky. You have different discount rates for the projects based upon the risk of the project. You discount them back and you can compare 2 projects of different risk profiles. And you may not want to proceed with a project that's going to show a profit because if I build a new res hall, I spend $10 million on it, and it's only going to show a profit of $100,000 a year, and all of a sudden enrollment drops, and I lose 15 students out of there, I'm going to now be losing $50,000 a year. And so all of a sudden you're going, man, that risk isn't good enough. It needs to be showing, 10% return. I need $1 million of excess cash flow coming off of that to account for the risk. And so you can have something that's profitable from an accounting perspective that is not profitable from an economic perspective, or not showing a positive net present value from a finance perspective, and that's okay. That's expected. And that's the analysis that we're doing. Any questions on that? I had coffee before class, if you haven't figured that out. All right. Here's 2 projects. Project S and Project L. Over a 4-year period. We're going to look at these 2 projects, and you can think of them as the construction of a new building, or more likely the purchase of a new machine, or the launch of a new product. And the cash flows here would tend to look like the launch of a new product. So what you've got in year 0 is essentially you're spending $3,000 to launch this new product. You've got product development costs, you've got marketing costs, and you're putting that in, and your net cash flow. And remember that term, net cash flow, because you're going to take a look at the cash flow for that period 0, You might have some money coming in, you're gonna have some money going out for expenses, and we're just measuring the bottom line. And it's cash flow. Remember, in finance, we're worried about cash. We're not worried about a bunch of other extraneous stuff. We're not worried about accounting, we're worried about cash. So we say, okay, $3,000 in cash goes out in period 1, or in period 0, at the beginning. In Excel, you put in negative $3,000. Then in period 1, Project S has $1,500 come back in net. So maybe $3,000 of revenue, $1,500 worth of cost of goods sold gets you to $1,500 net. Project L, $400. And so on. So period 2, 1,200 versus 900, 3,800 versus 1,300, or 300 versus 1,500. So you look at this and go, okay, which one, if they're exclusive, do I choose? If you look at Project S, you go, okay, same amount of money going out in 0 period. Period 1 and period 4 are the same. I got a plus $100 here in Project L, and I got a plus $100 here in Project L, and I got a plus $100 here in Project L. So I'm net, at the end of year 4, I'm net up $300 on Project L versus Project S. Which one should I choose? Yes, sir.
So you're doing way more way faster.
Exactly. So which one do I choose? Because time has a money value, money has a time value, right? And so the which one creates, if I have $1,500 now versus $1,500 at period 4, which one's worth more today? S. However, is $300 of cash flow difference enough to make this worth more than that?
How long is the life cycle?
4 years.
That's
This is it.
That's it.
This is it.
Well, if your business needs someone now,
If it's only,
So how are you going to figure that out? What component of the analysis is if your business needs the money now? Risk. So it depends. We don't know. Because we don't know what the discount rate is. If the discount rate is 0, then this is better. If the discount rate is 80%, this is going to be better. And so we're going to have to figure out what the discount rate is. And then it's just like a bond. I got cash flow, cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. Discounted at a discount rate. One's going to be higher than the other, and that's the one that wins, the other one loses. So let's take a look. We just walked through those cash flow timelines. If you set these up in Excel like this, and you use the NPV equals NPV formula, it'll calculate for you as long as you have. So we've got to figure out what the discount rate is. Well, for capital budgeting, normally you'll use a discount rate that's equal to the required rate of return, or what we'll find later in the semester, the cost of capital associated with that particular firm and or project. So in this particular case, it gives you a required rate of return of 10%. This looks just like the bonds, right? Minus 3,000 going out, discount, 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 based upon present value. Sum these up, and the net present value is $161.33. So 2 questions. Do you buy this thing or not? If it's independent. Why? Because the net present value is positive, which means based upon this risk, it's actually worth more. You're actually getting a higher IRR on this than the risk rate. And the risk is associated with the 10% discount. And so you're going, okay, I'm going to create economic wealth, economic profit on this project of $161.33. And it's important to think about that in terms of economic profit. Accounting profit is going to be significantly higher, right? You're going to have, let's see, 3,000 minus 1,500 is 1,500 minus 1,200 is 300. minus 800 is plus 500, plus 300 is plus 800. So you're gonna have accounting profit of $800 after 4 years. You're gonna have economic profit of $161.33. This is saying, hey, a 10% discount rate, a 10% required rate of return, I'm gonna proceed with this project because I've got economic profit here. Net present value. I'm going to leave with we're going to leave with this concept, then we're going to dive in on Friday to kind of a deeper discussion. Net present value is the present value of the expected future cash flows minus the cost. Your cost is going to be generally in period 0, and this is the net present value, or this is the present value of expected future cash flows. That's your net present value. Net because it's net of the cost. It's the net gain in wealth, economic profit. Not accounting profit, economic profit. We tend to use the word wealth so that we don't get confused with accounting profit. And it's, again, the two could be confusing. Just remember it's economic profit, not accounting profit. You will accept a project if the net present value is greater than 0. You can accept a project if it's equal to 0, but you're not creating any wealth at that point. So if a project is net present value greater than 0, you accept. If it's equal to or it's equal to 0, you've got a decision to make. And if it's less than 0, you don't accept. If you have mutually exclusive projects, so you can do the build a new residence hall, or build a fifth, or replace Barron Hall under mutually exclusive projects, you pick the one with the highest net present value. That will give you the most wealth. If neither of them have a positive net present value, which one do you choose? Neither one. And you pick the one that adds the most value. At the end of the day, your job as a manager in making these decisions is to drive value into the firm, drive shareholder value, drive stakeholder value. You want to take a more holistic view. And the way to do that is to pick projects and to invest capital in such a way as to drive economic value into the firm and economic value to the shareholders. And we utilize capital budgeting techniques to do that. Any questions? Thank you very much. I will see you on Friday.